There is a face that has been painted, sculpted, filmed, and imagined more times than almost any other face in human history. Elizabeth Taylor wore it on screen in 1963. Countless museum busts claim to represent it. Perfume brands and fashion houses invoke it. The face of Cleopatra VII, last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, last pharaoh of an independent Egypt, has become one of the most recognizable images in Western culture. And almost everything that image assumes about who she actually was is, at minimum, contested, and in several important respects, wrong. The debate over Cleopatra's true identity, her ancestry, her appearance, and what that appearance actually tells us about who she was, has been running for decades in academic circles, and has periodically erupted into wider public controversy. It intensified in 2023, when a Netflix documentary series cast a black actress in the role, triggering a reaction from the Egyptian government and a broader argument about history, representation, and the politics of who gets to claim one of antiquity's most iconic figures. Lost in that argument, which generated far more heat than light, was the actual evidence. The genetic and archaeological picture of who Cleopatra was, where she came from, and what the record actually does and does not say about her ancestry. That picture is more complicated, more interesting, and more historically honest than anything either side of the public argument was willing to acknowledge. To understand what the evidence actually shows, you have to start with what is beyond dispute. Cleopatra VII was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek-Macedonian royal house that had ruled Egypt since Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals, had claimed the country after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. For almost 3 centuries before Cleopatra's birth, the Ptolemies had ruled Egypt as pharaohs while remaining, in their language, their culture, and their dynastic identity, Greek. They had, in fact, been notorious for their insistence on maintaining this Greek identity. Ptolemaic rulers almost universally married within the dynasty, typically siblings or close relatives. A practice that was both a deliberate genetic strategy to maintain dynastic purity and a source of the periodic instability that came from generations of close inbreeding. Cleopatra herself was unusual within this tradition in one documented respect. She was, according to ancient sources, the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually learn Egyptian. Every pharaoh before her for nearly 300 years had ruled Egypt without speaking the language of its people. She spoke 9 languages total, according to Plutarch, and Egyptian was among them, along with Ethiopian Aramaic, Parthian, Hebrew Median, and several others. This linguistic range was not accidental. It was a deliberate political tool. A queen who could address her subjects, her allies, and her enemies in their own languages had a negotiating advantage that a monolingual ruler could never achieve. The Romans who dealt with her consistently noted, even in accounts hostile to her, that her ability to conduct negotiations without translators gave her an intelligence advantage in every room she entered. This linguistic distinctiveness has sometimes been cited as evidence of Egyptian ancestry, of a connection to the native population that her predecessors had maintained at arm's length. The linguistic evidence proves no such thing. Learning a language is not evidence of descent. It is evidence of intelligence and political calculation, both of which Cleopatra possessed in quantities that no contemporary account, regardless of its political agenda, ever disputed. The ancestry question is more specific and more genuinely contested than the language question, and it centers on a single figure about whom almost nothing is known: Cleopatra's mother. Cleopatra IV, often called Cleopatra Tryphaena, was the acknowledged wife of Ptolemy III and the mother of several of his children. But ancient sources are unclear and sometimes contradictory about whether she was the mother of Cleopatra VII specifically. The identity of Cleopatra VII's mother has never been definitively established from the ancient record. This gap matters because the Ptolemaic dynasty's reputation for endogamy was not absolute. There were documented cases of Ptolemaic rulers taking concubines or secondary wives from outside the Macedonian Greek circle. If Cleopatra's mother was not Cleopatra Tryphaena, but a secondary consort of non-Greek origin, then Cleopatra's ancestry becomes genuinely uncertain in ways that the standard Ptolemaic narrative does not account for. This is where the skeleton of Arsinoe IV becomes one of the most discussed and most contentious pieces of physical evidence in the entire debate. Arsinoe IV was Cleopatra's younger sister, whom Cleopatra had executed in 41 BCE to eliminate a political rival. The remains believed to be those of Arsinoe were discovered in Ephesus in 1926 in the Octagon Tomb, a monumental structure whose architectural prominence was consistent with royal burial. In 1997, forensic anthropologist Fabian Kanz of the Medical University of Vienna examined the skeletal remains and made a controversial finding. The cranial morphology of the skull, he concluded, showed characteristics that were more consistent with African ancestry than with Greek-Macedonian ancestry. If the remains were genuinely those of Arsinoe, and if the African cranial characteristics were genuine, then at least one of Ptolemy Shiai's children carried ancestry from a non-Greek, non-Macedonian source, almost certainly through the maternal line. The finding was immediately contested. Physical anthropology's ability to determine population ancestry from skull morphology is limited and disputed, and the identification of the remains as Arsinoe's was itself challenged on archaeological grounds. The skeleton was missing its skull when re-examined in later studies, which made further analysis impossible. The case for African ancestry in the Ptolemaic line, based on Arsinoe's skull, rests on evidence that is suggestive, but far from conclusive. And then the ancient DNA researchers arrived and discovered that the conditions in the Ephesus tomb had degraded the skeletal material beyond the point where usable genetic sequences could be extracted. The definitive genetic answer that modern science might have provided does not exist, not yet. What does exist is a body of circumstantial evidence that, taken together, prevents the confident assertion that Cleopatra was simply a Greek woman with no African or Egyptian ancestry, while also preventing the equally confident assertion that she was primarily African. The honest answer is that the maternal line of the later Ptolemies is genuinely unknown, and that the documented pattern of Ptolemaic intermarriage, while strongly Greek in its official record, does not preclude the possibility of non-Greek maternal contributions that the ancient sources had no incentive to record clearly. The ancient sources, it is worth noting, were predominantly written by Greeks and Romans who had their own interests in how Cleopatra was represented. Roman writers described her physical appearance in ways that were almost always filtered through a political agenda. Octavian, who defeated her, and Antony needed Cleopatra to be both seductive enough to explain Caesar's and Antony's enthrallment and foreign enough to justify her treatment as an enemy of Rome rather than as a partner of Rome's greatest generals. The Roman portrait of Cleopatra was always, to some degree, propaganda. A woman who had been the partner of Rome's two most powerful men for over 2 decades, who had very nearly succeeded in creating a Greco-Egyptian empire that would have rivaled Rome itself, was a figure that Roman writers could not represent with simple neutrality. They needed her to be something specific, and what they needed shifted depending on what political argument they were making at any given moment. Propaganda, built for political purposes by writers with political agendas, is a poor foundation for ancestral reconstruction 2,000 years after the fact. What the genetics cannot yet tell us, the archaeology and history tell us in a different register. Cleopatra V was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most politically capable rulers of the ancient world. She maintained Egyptian independence against the most powerful military force in the world for over 2 decades. She negotiated alliances with 2 successive Roman strongmen, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, using those alliances to preserve her kingdom in circumstances where almost any other ruler would have been immediately absorbed into the Roman provincial system. She reformed Egyptian agricultural policy, managed a complex multilingual bureaucracy, served simultaneously as pharaoh in the Egyptian religious tradition and as Hellenistic monarch in the Greek political tradition, and maintained the loyalty of a population that had every reason to resent Ptolemaic rule after 3 centuries of Greek cultural dominance. She was the last ruler of an independent Egypt. After her death in 30 BCE, Egypt became a Roman province and would not be independent again for nearly 2,000 years. Whether her ancestry was purely Macedonian Greek, or included Egyptian, North African, or sub-Saharan African components through an unrecorded maternal line, changes nothing about these achievements and changes nothing about the historical record of her reign. What it does change is the political uses to which her image has been put across the millennia since her death. Cleopatra's face has always been a screen onto which different eras have projected what they needed to see. The Renaissance projected a tragic Roman heroine destroyed by passion and political miscalculation. The Victorian era projected an exotic Oriental temptress whose sexuality was simultaneously fascinating and threatening. The 20th century projected Hollywood glamour, the image of Elizabeth Taylor in kohl-rimmed eyes becoming so dominant that it effectively replaced the historical person in popular imagination. The 21st century is projecting the identity politics of its own moment, with the Netflix controversy of 2023 demonstrating how completely the question of Cleopatra's appearance has become a proxy for contemporary arguments that have very little to do with the actual historical figure. None of these projections are the woman. The woman was a Macedonian Greek queen who may or may not have carried ancestry from the African continent through a mother whose identity history has not preserved, who learned Egyptian when every ruler before her had refused to, who ruled Egypt for 21 years with a political intelligence that no contemporary account, regardless of its politics, ever questioned, and who chose death on her own terms in 30 BCE, rather than walk in chains in a Roman triumph through the streets of a city that had never respected her as anything more than a useful tool of its own ambitions. The genetics are only beginning to approach the question of what she actually was in biological terms. Until they can answer it with the precision that a genome provides, the honest position is that we do not know. And not knowing is, in this case, more historically responsible than the certainty that both sides of the public argument have been offering. She deserves better than the certainty. She always did.